the polarisation politically is now so deeply entrenched that essentially you got two different worlds. You no longer have political opponents, but you have political enemies. That's the way that this is really seen. We need to have the moral high ground. We're the ones that believe in free speech. We're the ones that believe in debate. We're not scared of engaging with people who are not like us. But I think that Italy is very much in the firing line. And I really hope that the government in Italy has the nerve to hold the fort.
In some cases, the initiatives of the Italian government have been blocked by so-called international agreement or whatever at international level, taken by the Italian courts as an excuse to try to stop the initiative of the ministers.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. This week we're going to be taking a look at three really important stories. Obviously we're going to take a look at the fallout from the horrible assassination of Charlie Kirk in the USA, and especially what some European media outlets and politicians have been doing related to that. We're then going to take a look at a point of contention between the EU and the USA, namely the fallout around arguments about the DSA and America increasingly taking a harder line on speech restrictions online. And then we're going to come to the discussion around Israel. There's been lots of various protests against Israel, the conduct of the war, and also a talk of kicking them off Eurovision. And finally, we're going to take a look at migration from Lampedusa and beyond, and ask the question whether any European politicians can keep our borders safe. So this week on the podcast, really delighted to welcome a special guest, first time on the podcast for Marco Campansoni, who's a former MEP and Deputy Secretary General for the Patriots Group. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
We're delighted to have you. And actually, a while back for the podcast for Frank, it's been a while since we've had you on, but our Executive Director, Frank Faradi.
Pleasure to be here.
So our first topic, following the incredibly awful assassination of Charlie Kirk in America, which is really one of those signal events that sent shockwaves around the whole world and is going to completely dominate the American politics for the foreseeable future. There's been, obviously the main story around this, aside from how awful the assassination was the immediate sense that you had, especially people on the left in America, immediately welcoming, celebrating, openly cheering for this the brutal act of political violence. But here in Europe, it's also been somewhat kind of depressingly similar. In the European Parliament, we saw left MEPs and the leadership of the Parliament refusing to allow a minute's silence for Charlie Kirk. But also we've seen media outlets, notably one in Germany, spreading all kinds of lies and hate about what Charlie Kirk has been up to. But more broadly, Frank, what's been your take on this incredible event?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is obviously the reaction to the murder. The murder is terrible, but the way that the reaction unfolded indicates that the polarisation politically is now so deeply entrenched that essentially you got two different worlds. And you no longer have political opponents, but you have political enemies. That's the way that this is really seen. And when I look at the reaction of what's called the left or progressives, what's very interesting about it is that it is entirely infused with the politics of identity. So from their point of view, their hatred for Kirk isn't just simply the views that Kirk held, but it's also the fact that Kirk is basically a guy who dresses in a nice suit. He has got 2 children and a wife, and he's only 31, which is nothing like what they are. That he's got basic kind of common sense Christian kind of values, which again marks him out from their identity. And so you can imagine that from the point of view of a trans activist or somebody who's kind of a deeply committed person on the left, that person, Kirk, seems to them to be the personification of evil. And I think that's a tragedy that we've now come this far, which is why you have a situation where their celebration of Kirk's death, if you actually dig deep, is really very, very infantile. I mean, I looked at loads of these TikTok celebrations, and essentially it's like an unrestrained, untamed child just yelling and shouting in the way a 6-year-old sometimes would do when you see somebody stumble over there and you just kind of take delight in it. That's really what it sounded like. And it really tells us that this identitarian left has become so infantilized, so narcissistic, that to some extent they almost regard people like myself or you in a very dehumanized kind of way. In their eyes, Charlie Kirk is not a human being, but this kind of abstract enemy that they lash out against. And that's very, very dangerous, because that's really how violence becomes embedded in the system and is likely to become even more prevalent in the years ahead.
Yeah, Marco, what have you made of this, and especially reaction in Europe or in the European Parliament?
Well, it has been already told. It has been awful, of course, and but a lot of commentators, even people who have never heard about him before, spoke. Yeah, it has been an awful event, but he was racist, he was a suprematist. Fake news, totally fake news. I joked a bit with my friends. I'm not such a conservative person. I don't share 100% of the views, especially on religions. For me, religion is maybe less important than for Kirk. But the way he spoke with a young generation was something that in many cases, the politicians of all the parts, even from the right parts, they have lost. They don't know how to speak with the young generation. And especially in my country, Italy, we have seen comments by even journalists which were really crazy. I cannot use another word, because they did not know this person. They have never heard him, but as a form of narcissism in a way. They wanted to give a position. They wanted to say, yeah, but he was spreading hate. But it was exactly the opposite. What happened is exactly the opposite. The reaction of his wife is something we remember very well, and I think something has changed. And you remember one of the last messages of Kirk was about the murder of this Ukrainian woman who has shocked all the world. And he has told, even regarding this, that it would have changed things in the United States. I think the murder of Kirk will change the approach we have on hate in politics, especially the one coming from the left, is because, honestly, it's what we can see even in the European Parliament every time. We have cordon sanitaire, we have all these things which are made, of course, I know very well, because they are afraid to lose their power. It's only about that. But they are not defending, and they are not any kind of respect for the democracy, for the democratic values. But they say they do this because we don't respect these democratic values. It's really, as Mr. Vannac would say, il mondo al contrario, is the world on the contrary. What happened in the European Parliament, it's even very strange, because it has been argued by some bureaucrats, we make the minutes of silence in plenary only on Monday. So my friend Paolo Borchia commented, so I hope to die during a weekend. But can you imagine this? Is this an answer? In a way, it's better and more sincere, the comment of a president, a French MEP, a president of Renew, who told, no, it would have been not correct to give a minute of silence to remember Kirk, because he did not represent our values and so on. So this is true. They consider who does not have their same views on things as an enemy. Not a person with which we could speak and confront, and even in some cases, why not modify our views, or to know that there are other points of views apart our ones. And that's what Kirk tried, and I think did during his life.
Yeah, and Frank, just briefly, because we're going to release a longer discussion with you on some of these themes, but one of the things that's definitely come out, and Marco alluded to it there, is a sense that after this, I mean, the conduct of democracy is going to be kind of different in America. Both the people are pledging to go after the networks of NGOs that have either supported media outlets that have praised his death, something we've been doing a little bit of here at MCC Brussels, but also there's kind of been a slightly worrying turn against speech and debate on some of the comment. What's your view on this?
Well, it's something I worry about, because I don't want our side to adopt the same anti-democratic standards that our opponents do. And what I really worry about is that a lot of people who are followers of Kirk have been saying that the debate is now over. we're not going to argue with these people because they're not arguing with us. We're just going to go after them and get them. I think that's wrong, because I think that we need to have the moral high ground. That we're the ones that believe in free speech. We're the ones that believe in debate. We're not scared of engaging with people who are not like us. On the contrary, we welcome that debate because we know that genuine democratic debate helps our side. That's how we move forward in Europe and elsewhere. So I think it's very, very important that we don't react to their horrible reaction to Kirk's death by basically attempting to shut down that discussion. In fact, I believe that now is the time to really expose these so-called progressives for what they are. This is the time to really argue and expose the fact that these people don't even know the meaning of democracy, never mind live democratically. And now is the time for us to retain the moral high ground and really go to town, almost like a crusade for democracy, to indicate that we believe in democratic decision-making. We believe in parties competing against each other, voting, of being heard. We don't believe in shooting and killing. We don't believe in shutting people down administratively, because at the end of the day, we are the movement of freedom.
Yeah, and Marco, the legacy of Kirk was a believer in free speech and debate. That has to be kind of kept going.
Yeah, of course. But what has happened in Europe is that in too many cases, people not respecting the other points of view are, how to say, invading the debate, because you can ask this to some members of Rassemblement National, how the system in some cases, even the press in some cases, the extreme leftist parties try to avoid them to speak to the people, to meet the people. How many sovereignist movements, they have aggressions from extreme leftists. Even I remember in my life as a young militant of Lega, in many cases when Bossi or Matteo Salvini, our leaders, came to my city, we needed to have security forces, because extreme leftists came to try to disturb or interrupt our events. But a conservative, a person from the right side, has never thought in his life, okay, tomorrow there is an event from La France Insoumise, we go to try to interrupt them. It's not part of our political culture. It's something, of course, it's not part of a political reaction of making, how to say, my ideas more useful and more appreciated by the people. It's true that what we have now with social media, it's also that it seems more clear, this kind of a reaction by extremists. No, so. But I think that the most of people is not in that way. I think in another way as well, that the terrible, the awful murder of Mr. Kirk is a reaction of a woke system who know that they are losing, because there was a reaction in the United States. A lot of homosexual people say, hey, but I don't feel to be represented by you. The woke system is not defending my rights. I deal it personally. It's part of my own life. It's not something you are representing to me. And so, in a way, I think that the world was changing in a good way, and this violent reaction is the reaction of people who does not want to accept this.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. And we, obviously, here in Brussels, we've seen plenty of examples of how militant the kind of left's disdain against democracy really is. Well, sticking with freedom of speech, there's been a large number of cases that made a lot of media headlines. The new US administration under Trump has made it very clear that it believes that the rights of free speech online is something that it's going to really defend very strongly, especially obviously when that concerns American social media companies. And the reaction of the EU has been completely the opposite, to say we will defend the Digital Services Act to the death, which as we mentioned on the podcast last week, it's maybe the only thing that they will defend in negotiations with Trump. But Marco, we have you on this week. You've been in the heart of a lot of these discussions, both in the European Parliament and beyond. I wondered if you could give us a sense of the like the conversation and the flavor of how things are going, because there's some really strong words from the side of the Trump administration talking about potential sanctions on EU officials for going after speech online. But what have you made of this back and forward? And is there any chance of the EU actually backing down?
Yeah, because I remember very well that when we started to speak about Digital Services Act, even before its approval, we were only a few members of the parliament aware of the risk of that, because we came from the copyright directive a few years before, where it was more a fight between the traditional media against the social media, the world of the web, because there was also competition regarding who is putting money on this media and so on. So some political parties, especially in Germany and in France, wanted to defend the old press, so to say. And we, as opposition in Brussels, we thought since the beginning that social media were the only place where people could really freely speak. So Digital Services Act was something that me, Matteo Salvini, Marco Zani, my former colleagues, we focused as something problematic. And finally, it has been approved. You have seen very well how former Commissioner Breton implemented this tool, because in a way it could be, how to say, not be used in such a way, but these letters sent to all the owners of social media in order to ask them to block the content of users was something unbelievable. The fact that in this text they say that there are so-called trusted flaggers. They could decide that what you write is not correct, is a fake news, and it has to be cancelled. It's something, how to say, too much for a democracy. And so we have to thank the United States, because, of course, they do this because they believe it, but also because they have to defend an interest, because most of these enterprises, these social networks owners are from their country. They say, hey, this is not acceptable for us. What Vice President Vance told in Munich was very important in my opinion. So I hope that these negotiations between US and EU could go in the direction. I hope it would be great if we could modify or cancel this legislation, but at least to make the way that users could be free, because of course people could there are criminal laws in all the EU member states. If people violate criminal laws, or someone feels offended by what we publish in internet, everyone may act with national authorities, and everything could be done. So it's not a question of having a rule, how to say, blocking the freedom of speech, because what we have seen is not acceptable. Of course, the risk is that in future some of these social media say, okay, let's not have politics anymore here, because it's too much complicated to be managed. These European rules are too much complicated. The Digital Market Act also has created some problems. So this overruling is creating problems to free speech, as I told now, but it's also creating problems to people who wants to invest in Europe to create new subjects. And we have also the case of artificial intelligence. People who was trying to implement new tools on this sector in Europe had to take a flight to US, because they prefer to invest there where there are more possibilities, and not such, how to say, strict rules as a European Union is trying to do, not only on this area. We have seen the same on Green Deal and so on.
Yeah, and Frank, it's a sorry state of affairs when we have to sometimes, as it were, rely on American officials to come and remind us about free speech.
I think we need to be a bit realistic, because it's wrong to perceive this as just being about free speech. It is often used and as a way of manipulating the communication of different views, and therefore it is a very horrible act that's designed to limit the possibility for debate and discussion. But there's something else going on there, which is you have to remember that the European Union has lived off its capacity to regulate. It's continually regulating everything. And it's succeeded over the last 10 years in imposing its regulatory mechanisms on other societies, because Europe is a big market. The EU was able to say to the Americans and others, you have to adopt our regulation if you're going to be able to operate in Europe. So in that way, what the European Commission was doing was compensating for its weakness in economic terms, its weakness in terms of technological innovation, by continually inventing new rules. And in many respects, the Digital Services Act continues on with that kind of tradition. America is reacting to that, not simply because it's so fervently committed to free speech. I think that's a secondary importance for them. They're doing this because their big technological companies are being undermined and attacked by these kinds of rules. And they basically are saying that these rules curb our capacity to operate freely. And in that sense, what the Americans are doing is defending their national interest and the interest of their own companies. I think free speech is just an aspect of that. I'm very glad that J.D. Vance made those speeches in Munich and everything else, but we have to understand that there's something more fundamental going on here. And I think it's a tragedy. And I think this is something I hope the patriots and others will take on board. It's a tragedy that in Europe, we are not taking technological innovation seriously. We're not really saying, well, why don't we have startups? Why don't we have companies that are able to kind of create large technological platforms? Why do we have to hide behind rules and regulations all the time? Which basically is a very short-termist way of operating. So to that extent, the sooner we get rid of the DSA, the sooner we limit its teeth, the better, because it's an entirely dysfunctional act that doesn't just simply violate the norms of democratic communication. It also is economically a disaster area for Europe, that we are so much hiding behind rules and regulations rather than boldly taking a few risks.
Yeah, and it's only going to get worse. We know with they're going to implement new teeth to the regulations as part of the Democracy Shield and so on. So it becomes more important than ever, really, to get to grips with this. So another familiar topic for us on the podcast is obviously migration. I know it's been Lampedusa has been making headlines again in Italy, Marco, so maybe you can reflect on that. But in general, it seems that, we had this awful murder of that Ukrainian refugee in America, and people have noted that similar such things have been going on for quite a while in Europe, maybe not for different reasons. Here it's often kind of illegal, so-called asylum seekers that are committing these kinds of outrages in Europe, and there have been plenty of cases of this. But do you want to tell us, why has Lampedusa been in the headlines again in Italy recently, and what's the battle that we really need to win around migration?
The story is long because I remember since the beginning that the reaction of Europe, European Union, Brussels, and the other member states, apart Italy, was okay, we could manage a sort of redistribution of these people arriving to Lampedusa or to Sicily. And the Lega, Mr. Salvini, was the only one in Italy who thought, no, but this is not the solution. All over Europe there were other movements saying, hey, but it's not that. We have to block these people starting from Africa, from Asia, from where they come, and try to select there who really has the right to be protected because really escaping from wars and so on. And even as the Italian Secret Services know very well, but maybe not only the Italians, how the smugglers are working and how they operate, especially in Libya. And so, but all the Italian press and all the Italian political parties apart Lega, they were in favor of redistribution. Okay, they come here and then they go to Sweden, to France. This was an hypocritical way. Finally, our coalition in Italy now has also forced, in a way, the European Commission to be a bit more, looking at what was happening there. But if we have reach some solution, it's only because of bilateral initiatives by the Italian government. The actual government is speaking with Tunisia. It's very difficult to speak in Libya because you know very, very well how much is complicated there. Even if in Libya there are a lot of actors, Turkey is there, Erdogan is there, but Italy cannot go there to see what's up there. We have to do it unofficially. We have had some incidents a few months ago with the European Commission, because the situation is very complicated in Libya. But anyhow, the principle of the fact that we should manage and check who has the right to come to Europe or not, and the 90% of economic immigrants, we know, every one of us, especially on this route, the 90% of them are that. This principle is now accepted by many of the rightist parties in Europe. But the European Commission is not helping, of course, but member states are trying to do it by themselves. Anyhow, even if they don't make controls at the borders between European countries, they make these controls a few kilometers close to the border. This is making Germany with France and so on. So there is a lot of hypocrisy, but Italy is trying to solve this situation alone. You know very well that Salvini has been called in 2 courts in Palermo and Catania in order to respond of kidnapping. Is this acceptable? Of course, finally he has been acquitted. Nothing was there. He is not in interior minister in Italy because of this court case. Is dealing with transport and infrastructure, which is also very important. But something, there was a word, there was, how to say, a pressure from not democratic and not elected people who wanted to avoid us to react and to control borders. And listen, let's remember that in all our cities, the victims of illegal immigration are in some cases even legal immigrants, which are paying taxes, which have moved in the regular way in our countries, which are sharing the life in our streets with the same problems, but the illegal immigrants, and with all the links with Islamization, and a certain kind of Islamization we know very well. We don't have to speak about Brussels. No, it's very clear. So Lampedusa now is not so much a place where we need to be worried about what is happening. But if we have a situation which is better, of course it's not the best we dreamt for. It's only because of a political will from Rome, because the question, they told us, hey, you cannot solve the question. These migrations are something for which you cannot take any initiative to block them. No, it's a question of political will.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, we've got an event next week on the role of the courts, the ECJ and the ECHR, and we're going to be definitely touching on the direct way in which they facilitate this large-scale migration through various court rulings. But it's quite clear that the time when bureaucrats could kind of just ignore the need to strengthen Europe's borders is over, even if they haven't yet kind of started to take serious action. This issue is very much on the table now.
It is, at least rhetorically. And I think it's good that Europe, and especially Italy, is taking a few baby steps, but they are baby steps at the moment. And what's interesting is that, as Marco was saying, anything that's been effective has been done by the governments themselves rather than through the European Commission. And I'm drawing the conclusion that somehow or another, governments have got to declare very, very clearly that we have to get away from a regime where we try to share out the illegal migrants between different countries, where we try to find these solutions within Europe. You have to basically close Europe down to illegal migration. And the elephant in the room is, and everybody knows this, is that the only way you're going to deal with illegal migration is by the use of essentially security, military reaction, because in a sense you have to defend your borders, and you can't defend your borders by actually allowing people to land in your country. You have to prevent those people from coming to your country in the first place. And that's something that I think Hungary has recognized and acted on. It's much easier for Hungary than maybe it's for some other countries. But I think that Italy is very much in the firing line. And I really hope that the government in Italy has the nerve to hold the fort, and if anything, maybe take a few extra steps to kind of stop and prevent this from happening. Because I know when I go to Italy, and I've been going to Italy for a very long time, it doesn't look the same anymore. I know that a lot of the damage has been done already in a very short period of time. And I dread to think that unless we stop this from occurring, what Italy will look like 10 years from now. So this is actually an emergency that we need to basically see very, very clearly. And I know that, for example, Britain is now playing around with France, with saying that you can have one person and we can take one person back. What's happened is that the first attempt to do that, the first 2 days when they tried to have this little exchange, it just collapsed because of legal intervention. And it's become a farce. It's become a joke altogether. And I think that the time has now come for people like us to really go to town and explain that what's needed is not going to the courts. Ignore the courts altogether, because the courts are there to perpetuate the existing state of events. What needs to be done is a political will and political decisions taken that just cut across all these obstacles that the courts are creating.
In some cases, the initiatives of the Italian government have been blocked by so-called international agreement or whatever at international level, taken by the Italian courts as an excuse to try to stop the initiative of the ministers. And so this is something for which when, for example, Mrs. Meloni was at the opposition, she declared some things, and now it seems that it's a bit more difficult to make the same. But finally, for example, we have tried, and we are still trying to speak with third countries as Albania, where we could move immigrants. But even in this case, immigrants, in order to check how and when they could be sent back to their countries of origins. But even in these cases, courts have put a lot of difficulties. So the prompt reaction is not easy to be taken. We are not in the United States, where the president has maybe more power and they could be implemented in a fast way. And I know that it's a concern, and I know that Salvini and Lega are pushing a lot in order to concentrate on this and less on other very important, why not, international issues where their effects are not so relevant for the Italian citizens.
Yeah, well, with one of the things that we're going to grapple with next week in our event about the role of the ECR and the ECJ is precisely the fact that the local courts now have taken on so much of this power that the international courts barely even have to lift a finger anymore, because the precedents have all been set by the international courts, and now the local courts and activist judges at home are able to basically thwart anything that any of the elected governments try and do. So this is a huge issue for Europe, one that, I mean, our viewers on the podcast will be releasing material, of course, from our event next week, so they can look forward to that. Okay, so finally for this week, coming on to Israel, a topic we occasionally cover on the podcast, but last week has been a real kind of eye-opener in terms of the international debate and discussion. Only a few days ago, we had Commissioner Ribeira saying that there was definitely a genocide going on being conducted by Israel. And then in recent days, we've had incredible events in Spain, both the disruption of a cycling event and also numerous comments by the Prime Minister. But Marco, it seems that in recent days or weeks, the tone has really shifted in Europe and becoming a lot more stridently against Israel. What have you made of all this?
Yeah, I'm afraid that I respect all the positions, some of the positions, because honestly, some people defending the interests of Palestine and of the Gaza people, they don't say too much what really Hamas is and how much it would be important, even for people who wants to defend those people, that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So my point of view, of course, is different by these people, but I really don't understand why to avoid to a singer to participate to Eurovision or to block a cycling event because there are Israeli cyclists is something useful to help the life of Gaza or Palestinian people in general. So, but what is even more and more sad is that President Sanchez finally seemed to endorse, in a way, some actions, and this is something not really clever, even because it's how to say justify violence. We spoke about what happened to Kirk, but in a way, some people could believe that could be and could do even more in future in order to defend their point of view on this thing. So, and which is the final point? So we block Israeli people to travel, to come to holiday in Sardinia, as it happened a few days ago. It's something I really don't understand, because I don't think it's useful for any kind of point of view regarding the situation over there. So I hope that a solution could be finally found in order to avoid this. But this is also something who teaches us a lot about how the level of some politicians in Europe is so weak, because I know people having a point of view closer to the Gaza and Palestinian point of view, but they don't act in that way. I think that what the Spanish government is doing is a bit too much. We know a lot of cases, even in Brussels, the students of the ULB inviting the extreme leftist woman, which is a clear supporter of Hamas. So I don't know where they want to go. I think they are not responsible enough in order to know which could be the reaction of the people, feeling to be endorsed by them.
Yeah, well, if we said earlier, Frank, that the Charlie Kirk kind of came in to stand in as a figure of evil for these people, which justified any actions being taken against them. A similar thing is increasingly happening with Israel.
It does, and I think that the actions of the Irish government, the Spanish government in particular, very much reflects an attempt to tell the world that we're not evil, we're not like these people are. And what's now happening is a very systematic way in which, first of all, whatever Israel does, it's basically seen as an act of evil. Israel is being unfairly sort of charged with the act of genocide. And worst of all, what I find most disturbing is you have a situation where even Jewish people have got nothing to do with Israel are being targeted just simply for being Jewish. When you have a situation where a conductor of a German classical orchestra, I think it's in Ghent, is told that he cannot play there because he's Jewish, then you realize that something sordid, something very disturbing is happening. And it seems to me that what you now have is a situation where there's a lot of politicians who are too scared to open their mouth and to say that enough is enough, that this is not allowed, this shouldn't happen in a democratic society, that you target individuals, that you should, in a sense, stand up, even if you don't like Israel, at the very least you have to fight anti-Semitism instead of encouraging that. So I think that the situation has become very, very important, and I think that the most disturbing thing, and this relates to our discussion of migration, is that what's happening, the attacks on Israel, are not disconnected from the way in which Islamism is becoming more normalized and more accepted within European societies. Because whether you like it or not, Israel is really the main bulwark, the main actor, the main kind of defender of Western civilization against the Islamic sort of Islamist kind of politicized Islam threat. And if Israel becomes morally undermined in the way that the Spanish government is trying to pursue it, then Europe too will pay a very, very big price for that.
Yeah, well, plenty we'll be digging into over the next weeks on all these topics on migration, the DSA, and we'll keep an eye out on issues related to Israel. But if you enjoyed this week's episode of the podcast, make sure you're subscribed to us wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a comment on things you'd like us to cover in future episodes. But for now, thanks so much, Marco, for joining us. Real pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
And Frank, thanks for coming back.
Pleasure.